Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the dawn of the nuclear age and the end of a war. Chapter 1. The Manhattan Project's Shadow. As 1945 began, a secret race was already underway in the deserts of New Mexico. Deep in the classified laboratories of Los Alamos, the world's brightest scientific minds worked tirelessly under the command of physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer. Their mission, codenamed the Manhattan Project, would forever alter the course of human history. The air crackled with both scientific excitement and moral tension. Nobel Prize winners stood shoulder to shoulder with military personnel, united in their quest to harness the unfathomable power locked within the atom. The stakes were impossibly high. Intelligence suggested that Nazi Germany was pursuing the same technology. It was a race no one could afford to lose. On July 16, 1945, in the pre-dawn darkness at Alamogordo, the first nuclear explosion ever detonated cast an eerie glow across the desert. Oppenheimer, watching the mushroom cloud rise, whispered words from the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The atomic age had begun, not with diplomatic fanfare, but with a blinding flash that temporarily outshone the sun. What only a select few knew was that this weapon would soon be deployed not against Nazi Germany, which had already surrendered in May, but against an enemy still fighting fiercely in the Pacific. Chapter 2. Japan's Desperate Resistance. By mid-1945, Imperial Japan stood alone. Germany was defeated, Europe was beginning its painful recovery, but in the Pacific, Japanese forces maintained their fanatical resistance. The empire that had launched the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 now faced the full might of the Allied forces. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa had revealed the horrifying cost of invading Japanese territory. American military planners estimated that a full-scale invasion of the Japanese home islands, Operation Downfall, would cost up to 1 million Allied casualties and potentially several million Japanese lives. Kamikaze attacks had intensified, with young Japanese pilots deliberately crashing explosive-laden aircraft into American ships. Behind closed doors in Tokyo, the Japanese Supreme Council remained divided. Moderates secretly sought ways to negotiate peace, while hardline military leaders vowed to fight to the last man, woman, and child. Emperor Hirohito, revered as a living god by his people, hesitated between these factions as his empire crumbled around him. Messages intercepted and decoded by American intelligence painted a grim picture. Japan was preparing its civilian population for a final, apocalyptic defense of their homeland. Children practiced with bamboo spears. Civilians dug tunnels and fortifications. The planned invasion promised to be a bloodbath of unprecedented proportions. Chapter 3. The Fateful Decision. President Harry S. Truman had been in office for only 3 months following Roosevelt's death, when he was fully briefed on the Manhattan Project. The weight of the most consequential military decision in history now rested on the shoulders of a man who had not even known about the atomic bomb's existence during his vice presidency. In the White House and the Pentagon, fierce debates raged. Some military officials argued for a demonstration of the bomb's power on an uninhabited island, with Japanese observers present. Others insisted that only the shock of a direct attack on a military target would force Japan's surrender. Scientists who had helped create the weapon now found themselves divided over its use. Secretary of War Henry Stimson presented Truman with a list of potential targets. Kyoto was removed due to its cultural significance. Eventually, Hiroshima, a manufacturing center and army headquarters, was selected as the primary target. The secondary target was Kokura, with Nagasaki as the tertiary option. On July 25, 1945, Truman gave the final order. The atomic bomb would be dropped as soon as weather permitted after August 3rd. In his diary that night, Truman wrote, "We have discovered the most terrible bomb in the history of the world. It is certainly a good thing for the world that Hitler's crowd or Stalin's did not discover this atomic bomb. It seems to be the most terrible thing ever discovered, but it can be made the most useful." The machinery of destruction was now in motion, and the world stood unknowingly at the threshold of a new era. Chapter 4. The Enola Gay's Journey. Before dawn on August 6, 1945, a modified B-29 Superfortress bomber named Enola Gay after the pilot's mother, took off from Northfield Air Base on Tinian Island. Colonel Paul Tibbets and his hand-picked crew of 12 men carried a single bomb nicknamed Little Boy, containing 141 pounds of enriched uranium. As they approached the Japanese mainland, the men experienced a strange juxtaposition. The serene beauty of the morning sky contrasted sharply with their apocalyptic mission. Photography officer First Lieutenant Harold Agnew later recalled, "It was the most beautiful sunrise you've ever seen. The weather was perfect, not a cloud in the sky." The crew had been extensively trained for this single mission, yet none except Tibbets fully understood the destructive force they were about to unleash. They had been told only that this new weapon might help end the war quickly. Weapons officer Morris Jepson armed the bomb in flight, removing safety devices one by one. At 8:15 a.m. local time, the Enola Gay reached Hiroshima. The city was going about its Monday morning routine, workers commuting, children heading to school, people opening shops. The air raid sirens had sounded earlier, but with no visible enemy formations, life had returned to normal. Tibbets executed a perfect approach. Bombardier Thomas Farabee lined up the aiming point, the distinctive T-shaped Ioi Bridge in the city center. The bomb bay doors opened. Little Boy fell free. The crew had been instructed to immediately turn the aircraft 159 degrees and dive away at maximum speed. 43 seconds later, the world changed forever. Chapter 5, August 6th, Hiroshima's Apocalypse. The uranium bomb detonated approximately 1,900 feet above Hiroshima, precisely as designed. For a split second, those looking directly at the blast saw a flash brighter than 1,000 suns. Then came the thunderclap and inferno. The temperature at the hypocenter reached approximately 7,000 degrees, hot enough to vaporize human beings, leaving only shadows burned into walls and stone steps. The shock wave, traveling at over 1,000 miles per hour, flattened everything within a 1-mile radius. Wooden structures collapsed instantly. Concrete buildings were gutted. Glass windows shattered up to 12 miles away. As the fireball rose into the atmosphere, it formed the now iconic mushroom cloud that stretched nearly 40,000 feet high. Below, the city was transformed into a hellish landscape. Firestorms erupted as thousands of smaller fires converged, creating hurricane-force winds that pulled victims into the flames. Survivors described the horror in testimony that haunts us still. Sunao Tsuboi, then a university student, recalled, "I saw a flash of white, then everything went dark. When I regained consciousness, my skin was hanging from my body like rags." Akiko Takakura, one of the few survivors from near the hypocenter, remembered, "People were running with their arms outstretched. Their skin was hanging in ribbons. They looked like ghosts. By nightfall, perhaps 80,000 people were dead. Many had been killed instantly by the blast and heat. Others succumbed to terrible burns, crushing injuries, or radiation exposure that was still not understood. The city's medical infrastructure was devastated. 70% of Hiroshima's doctors and nurses were either dead or too injured to work. And yet, incredibly, Japan's military leadership still refused to contemplate surrender. Chapter 6. 3 Days of Silence. As reports of Hiroshima's destruction reached Tokyo, confusion reigned. Initial military assessments mentioned a new type of bomb, but failed to grasp its revolutionary nature. Some officials even believed the Americans had employed multiple bombers in a massive conventional raid. President Truman issued a public statement. "If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth." Leaflets were dropped over Japanese cities warning civilians of more atomic attacks. In the imperial palace, Emperor Hirohito requested information about this new weapon. Scientists who understood nuclear physics explained the implications with growing horror. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo urged immediate acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, the Allied ultimatum demanding Japan's unconditional surrender. Yet the Supreme Council remained deadlocked. Military hardliners, led by War Minister Korichika Anami, argued that the Americans could not possibly have many atomic bombs. They insisted that Japan should fight on, accepting honorable annihilation rather than surrender. In Washington, military commanders prepared a second strike. The plutonium implosion bomb, Fat Man, was more complex and powerful than the uranium weapon dropped on Hiroshima. Originally scheduled for August 11th, the mission was moved up to August 9th due to forecasts of deteriorating weather. As Japanese citizens in other cities looked fearfully at the skies, as Hiroshima's survivors lay dying from radiation sickness not yet understood by medical science, the countdown to a second nuclear attack had already begun. Chapter 7. Nagasaki's Dark Fate. The morning of August 9th dawned with low clouds and rain over Japan. Major Charles Sweeney piloted a B-29 bomber named Boxcar, carrying Fat Man, a plutonium implosion bomb even more powerful than the weapon dropped on Hiroshima. The primary target was Kokura, an industrial city with a large military arsenal. But as Boxcar arrived overhead, thick smoke from conventional bombings of nearby cities and deliberate factory emissions obscured the aiming points. After making 3 failed approaches and with fighter aircraft spotted rising to intercept them, Sweeney made the fateful decision to divert to the secondary target, Nagasaki. Nagasaki was an unusual city, built along narrow valleys between mountains, with a significant Christian population dating back to 16th century Portuguese missionaries. Its shipyards and armament factories made it a military target, but on that morning, many parts of the city were protected by partial cloud cover. At 11:02 a.m., Fat Man detonated 1,650 feet above the northern part of the city. The mountains that surrounded Nagasaki partially contained the blast, but the destruction was still catastrophic. The explosion was equivalent to 21,000 tons of TNT, 40% more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. The hypocenter was near Urakami Cathedral, then the largest Christian church in Asia. It was completely destroyed, with hundreds of worshippers vaporized during morning prayers. The nearby Nagasaki Medical College Hospital was annihilated with all its patients and most of its staff. Survivor Sumiteru Taniguchi, a 16-year-old postal worker, was delivering mail a mile from the hypocenter. The heat was so intense that I felt like I was standing in front of a blast furnace. My back was burned so badly that you could see my backbone. I lay on my stomach for 1 year and 9 months in the hospital, unable to move. By nightfall, at least 40,000 people were dead, with tens of thousands more injured. The final death toll would exceed 70,000 by the end of 1945. Chapter 8. The Emperor's Voice. In Tokyo, news of Nagasaki's destruction coincided with a shocking diplomatic development. The Soviet Union, previously neutral against Japan, had declared war and invaded Manchuria. The Japanese army, once considered invincible, was being rapidly overwhelmed on this new front. The Supreme Council met in an underground bunker, still divided on whether to accept surrender. The military faction insisted on 4 conditions: preservation of the imperial system, self-disarmament, self-conducted war crimes trials, and no occupation of the homeland. Foreign Minister Togo argued that only one condition was essential: the preservation of the emperor. The Allied powers had deliberately left this possibility open in the Potsdam Declaration, using language that could accommodate a constitutional monarchy without explicitly saying so. For the first time in Japan's history, Emperor Hirohito intervened directly in a political decision. In a quiet voice, he stated, "I cannot bear to see my innocent people suffer any longer. Continuing the war can only result in the annihilation of our nation and a prolongation of bloodshed and cruelty in the world." On August 15, 1945, another unprecedented event occurred. The emperor's voice, never before heard by common citizens, was broadcast nationwide over radio. In formal, courtly Japanese that many listeners struggled to understand, Hirohito announced Japan's acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration. He never used the word surrender. Instead, he said Japan would endure the unendurable and suffer the insufferable. He cited a new and most cruel bomb as a reason for ending the war, acknowledging that the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. As his voice faded from the airwaves, World War II, the deadliest conflict in human history, had effectively ended. Chapter 9. The Occupation and the Scarred Cities. In early September 1945, American occupation forces arrived in Japan. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, began implementing the most ambitious foreign reconstruction project yet attempted. Japan would be demilitarized, democratized, and eventually rebuilt. The occupation authorities censored reports about the atomic bombing's effects. Photographs, medical studies, and survivor accounts were classified. It wasn't until 1952 that the full horror of radiation sickness and long-term health effects became widely known. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, survivors faced discrimination from other Japanese who feared radiation was contagious. These hibakusha, explosion-affected people, suffered from leukemia, cancer, chronic burns, and birth defects in their children at rates far exceeding the general population. Yet remarkably, both cities were rebuilt. Hiroshima deliberately preserved the skeletal dome of its Industrial Promotion Hall, now known as the Atomic Bomb Dome, as a memorial. The city built Peace Memorial Park around it, with a museum documenting the bombing and its aftermath. Every August 6, thousands gather there for a ceremony where paper lanterns float down the Motoyasu River, one for each victim. Nagasaki constructed its own peace park near the hypocenter, centered around a massive bronze statue with one hand pointing upward to the threat of nuclear weapons, and the other extended horizontally, symbolizing eternal peace. From the ashes of atomic destruction, these cities transformed themselves into global symbols of peace and nuclear disarmament. Their museums and memorials have been visited by over 100 million people, including world leaders and the children and grandchildren of those who authorized and executed the bombings. Chapter 10. The Nuclear Shadow. When the Allied occupation ended in 1952, Japan adopted a constitution that forever renounced war. Article 9 declared that the Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation and the threat or use of force as means of settling international disputes. But elsewhere, the nuclear genie could not be returned to its bottle. By 1949, the Soviet Union had tested its first atomic bomb. Britain followed in 1952, France in 1960, and China in 1964. The arms race accelerated into hydrogen bombs 1,000 times more powerful than those dropped on Japan. At the height of the Cold War, approximately 70,000 nuclear warheads existed worldwide, enough to destroy human civilization many times over. The doctrine of mutual assured destruction kept an uneasy peace between superpowers, while proxy wars raged across the developing world. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the survivors aged, but their testimony grew more powerful. Sadako Sasaki, exposed to radiation at age 2, developed leukemia 10 years later. Before her death, she folded nearly 1,000 origami cranes, following a Japanese legend that folding 1,000 would grant her wish for healing. Her story spread worldwide, and today thousands of paper cranes arrive in Hiroshima each year from school children across the globe. Physicist Robert Oppenheimer, who had quoted the Bhagavad Gita at the Trinity test, later reflected, "The physicists have known sin, and this is a knowledge which they cannot lose." His security clearance was revoked during the McCarthy era partly because of his moral qualms about the hydrogen bomb. Colonel Paul Tibbets, who piloted the Enola Gay, never expressed regret for his role. Until his death in 2007, he maintained that the bombings saved lives by averting an invasion. "I sleep clearly every night," he often said. Often. Today, the world's nuclear arsenal stands at approximately 13,000 warheads, reduced but still capable of ending civilization. 9 nations possess these weapons. The threat of nuclear terrorism looms, and the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki continue to raise their voices with a simple message: never again. As climate change, artificial intelligence, and biotechnology present new existential challenges to humanity, the lesson of these 2 destroyed cities remains urgently relevant. The dawn of the nuclear age was also the beginning of an era in which, for the first time, humans gained the power to destroy themselves. How we manage technologies of unprecedented destructive potential may determine whether our species has a future at all. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not just the final chapter of World War II. They were the opening pages of our present moment, a world living under the shadow of its own immense power, seeking wisdom adequate to control it. If you liked this video, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share it.